Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a book that's been making waves, Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F.
Yeah, it's definitely not your typical self-help book.
Right. I mean, the title itself is kind of provocative, but I think that's part of what makes it so interesting.
Absolutely. It challenges a lot of the conventional wisdom about happiness and success.
So for this deep dive, we really want to help you figure out how to, better prioritize your thoughts and your energy. And this book offers some honestly pretty radical ideas on how to actually do that.
It really does. It kind of forces you to confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself and about the world.
Okay, so let's jump right in. One of the first things that really struck me was Manson's argument that our constant pursuit of happiness, like always trying to be positive, might actually be making us less happy.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds counterintuitive, right? But he makes a pretty compelling case.
He does. He talks about how modern society is kind of obsessed with positivity and avoiding negative emotions at all costs.
And that this can actually backfire.
Right. Like, he uses this analogy of trying to walk towards a house while on acid. The harder you try to reach it, the further away it seems.
Yeah. It's a funny image, but it actually illustrates a psychological concept called the backwards law.
The backwards law.
Yeah. Basically, it says that the more we chase happiness, the more we reinforce the feeling that we lack it. You know, it's like by always striving for happiness, we're actually making ourselves more aware of how unhappy we are.
So it's like this vicious cycle. We want to be happy, but the more we want it, the more unhappy we feel. So we try even harder to be happy, and so on.
Precisely. And this can show up in so many areas of our lives, you know, like our careers, our relationships, even our pursuit of material possessions.
Oh, totally. Like, think about a time when you really wanted something, maybe a promotion at work or that new phone that everyone's talking about. Did you find yourself like actually feeling worse about not having it the more you focused on getting it?
Yeah, or like you finally get it and the feeling of satisfaction is fleeting, and then you're on to the next thing.
Right, exactly. The wanting itself becomes the problem.
Yeah. And that kind of brings us to Manson's central point, the idea of strategically choosing what to give a f about.
Okay, so I think it's important to clarify here. He's not saying we should just be apathetic or indifferent to everything.
Right, exactly.
It's more about recognizing that our energy and attention are limited resources.
Yes. We only have so much to give.
Right, and we need to be intentional about where we direct them. Otherwise, we're going to be spreading ourselves too thin and ending up feeling, exhausted and unfulfilled.
Absolutely. It's about deciding what truly aligns with your values and focusing your energy on those things. And, consciously letting go of the rest.
It's kind of like that story Manson tells about the elderly woman obsessing over a 30-cent coupon at the grocery store.
Oh, yeah. I love that story.
On the surface, it seems like such a small thing.
But he uses it to illustrate how a lot of times we fill the void in our lives with things that we think we should care about.
When deep down, what we're really craving is, something more.
Deeper meaning, a sense of purpose.
Yeah. So I'm curious, have you ever caught yourself doing something similar?
Oh, all the time. Especially in this day and age where we're constantly bombarded with information and opinions and demands on our attention. It's so easy to get caught up in that noise and lose sight of what's truly important.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly being pulled in a million different directions.
Exactly. So it's more important than ever to be deliberate about where we choose to invest our energy.
Okay, so how do we actually start figuring out what is worth giving a fuck about?
Well, this is where things get even more interesting because Manson dives into this idea that suffering is actually an inevitable part of life.
He tells that parable, right?
Yeah, the one about the prince who is like sheltered from all the harsh realities of the world. And then one day he ventures out and is confronted with, sickness and poverty and death.
And it totally throws him into an existential crisis.
Totally. And he becomes convinced that the key to enlightenment is to suffer.
So he ditches his comfortable life and intentionally seeks out hardship.
Exactly. But of course, suffering just sucks. It doesn't, magically lead to enlightenment or happiness.
So what's the point of that story?
Well, Manson's point is that we can't avoid suffering altogether. It's just part of the human experience.
Okay, so we can't avoid it. So then what are we supposed to do?
The key, he says, is to choose meaningful struggles, ones that are aligned with our values.
Okay. But how do we know if we're choosing the right struggles?
It's tricky because, think about it. You decide to have a date night to try and improve your relationship, right?
Sounds like a good idea.
Right. It seems simple enough, but then, you have to figure out what to do, how to make it special, how to actually reconnect. You solve one problem and a whole new set of problems emerge.
And that's just like date night. That's not even, like the big stuff.
Exactly. And that's Manson's point. That's how life works. The solution to one problem often creates the next problem.
So it's not about, finding a way to live a problem-free life. It's about learning how to navigate those problems in a way that's consistent with what we value.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But I think one of the things that can really trip us up is, the way we measure success.
Oh, absolutely.
Like Manson tells these contrasting stories in the book. One about an entrepreneur named Jimmy, who's basically living in a complete delusion. And then the other about Dave Mustaine, the musician from Megadeth, who on the surface seems to have it all, the fame, the fortune, but still feels like a failure.
Right. It's like two sides of the same coin. Like he's surrounded by evidence to the contrary, but he's just refusing to see it, which I think is a really good example of how inflated self-esteem can actually mask a deeper inability to face reality and take responsibility.
And then you have Dave Mustaine, who has achieved, massive success in the music industry, but he's still measuring his success against his former band, Metallica.
Which is a classic example of how choosing the wrong metrics for success can lead to like this persistent feeling of inadequacy no matter what you achieve.
So the takeaway here is that we need to be really mindful about what we're measuring ourselves against.
Absolutely. Because if we're constantly chasing external validation, we're essentially giving our power away, right? Like we're letting someone else define what success means for us.
Which means we're never going to actually feel successful on our own terms.
Exactly.
And this leads to another really important point that Manson makes, which is the importance of owning our problems. He makes this distinction between, fault and responsibility. So, we might not be at fault for everything that happens in our lives, but we are always responsible for how we choose to respond.
Okay, I see. Like, we can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we react to it.
Right, exactly. And he shares this, really personal story in the book about getting caught hiding marijuana in middle school.
Oh, yeah. I remember that story.
And he's very clear that, while his parents weren't to blame for his actions, the consequences of that experience really shaped him in some profound ways.
Yeah. And he talks about how it led him down this path of avoiding responsibility, especially in his early relationships.
Yeah, he would blame his partners for his own unhappiness. It's almost like he felt entitled to a certain level of happiness, and when he didn't get it, he would lash out or withdraw.
Right. Which I think is a common pattern. Like when we don't own our problems, we often end up blaming others and feeling like victims.
It's interesting, though, because, taking responsibility can be tough. And Manson actually goes on to talk about how sometimes, our perception of reality itself can get in the way.
Right. Like we think we're being responsible, but maybe we're actually clinging to a narrative that isn't entirely accurate.
Exactly. And he uses some pretty intense examples to illustrate this point. He talks about this author, Meredith Moran, who, believe it or not, falsely accused her father of abuse.
Yeah. It's a pretty shocking story, but it really highlights how our brains are kind of wired to create meaning, even if it's not based on facts.
She genuinely believed that her father had abused her, but it turned out to be a completely fabricated memory.
Yeah. And it's not to say that her experience wasn't real or valid. It's more about recognizing that our memories aren't always reliable. They can be influenced by all sorts of things, our emotions, our beliefs, even things we've read or heard.
So basically, even when we think we're being objective, we might actually be filtering information through our own preconceived notions.
Exactly. And I think the takeaway here is that it's so important to question our own beliefs, even the ones that feel deeply true to us.
It's almost like we have to be willing to be wrong.
Yeah. Because sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about our lives, they might not be the whole story, right? Or even they might not be accurate at all.
And clinging to those stories can actually prevent us from growing and moving forward.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, right? Have there been times in your own life where you held on to a belief that, turned out to be wrong? And what helped you, recognize that and shift your perspective?
I mean, I think that's part of, being human. We're constantly learning and evolving. And sometimes that means letting go of old beliefs that no longer serve us.
And that can be scary, right? Because it's almost like we're, admitting that we were wrong about something.
It can be, but it's also incredibly liberating.
So how do we actually go about challenging our own assumptions and beliefs?
Well, I think it starts with being open to new information. Being willing to listen to perspectives that are different from our own.
And not just listening, but actually, really considering them.
Right. Trying to see things from another person's point of view, even if we don't agree with them.
Okay, so we got to be open-minded. But is there anything else we can do to, actively challenge our beliefs?
Yeah, Manson talks about this really practical principle that he calls the do something principle.
The do something principle. What's that?
It's basically the idea that action is the key to unlocking motivation and changing our values.
Okay, so not just thinking about it, but actually doing something.
Exactly, because we tend to think, oh, I need to feel motivated before I can take action. But Manson argues that it's often the other way around. Like, we take action and then the motivation follows.
Can you give me an example of how this works?
Sure, he tells the story of how he launched his own dating advice blog, right? Even though he was, terrified of self-employment and had no idea what he was doing.
So he just, jumped in head first?
Pretty much. And by simply taking action, even though he felt scared and uncertain, he started to, gain momentum. He started to see results, and that, in turn, fueled his motivation to keep going.
So it's like that old saying, fake it till you make it, but maybe a little more nuanced.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about, pretending to be someone you're not. It's about taking action even when you don't feel ready and trusting that the motivation will follow.
It's almost like we have to, give ourselves permission to suck at something at first.
Right, because we're not going to be good at everything right away. And that's okay. The important thing is to just start.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of being open-minded and taking action. But I'm curious, how does this all tie back to the idea of, not giving a fuck?
Well, that's where the whole concept of boundaries comes in.
Boundaries.
Yeah. Manson argues that setting boundaries is crucial for, defining our values and shaping our identity.
Okay. So what does that look like in practice?
Well, we often feel this pressure to say yes to everything, right? To please everyone. But saying no is what allows us to create space for what truly matters.
So it's about being selective with our time and energy.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that we can't be everything to everyone.
He uses that contrast, right, between Romeo and Juliet, like that classic romantic ideal of, all-consuming love.
Yeah. It's a powerful image, but it's also, pretty unhealthy.
And he contrasts that with, the modern tendency to romanticize codependent relationships.
Right, which can be just as damaging.
It's like we're so afraid of being alone that we end up clinging to relationships that aren't actually serving us.
Exactly. And I think the key here is recognizing that a healthy relationship is about supporting each other's growth, not about trying to control each other's emotions or behaviors.
So how do boundaries fit into this?
Boundaries are what allow us to maintain our own individual responsibility within a relationship.
So not taking on responsibility for our partner's feelings, or blaming them for our own unhappiness.
Right. Manson gives some really clear examples of this, like blaming your partner for a ruined weekend, or taking on responsibility for their emotional state.
And he says this can lead to some pretty unhealthy dynamics.
Absolutely. Resentment builds up, communication breaks down, and ultimately the relationship suffers.
So setting boundaries is about protecting ourselves.
It's about protecting ourselves, yes, but it's also about protecting the relationship. Because when we have healthy boundaries, we're able to show up as our best self.
Almost like by taking care of our own needs, we're actually better able to support our partners.
Exactly. It's not selfish. It's essential for a healthy and sustainable relationship.
Okay. So we've talked about how, we can get tripped up by the backwards law, by false metrics for success, by avoiding responsibility. And then Manson goes on to talk about this even bigger topic, right?
Oh, yeah. He takes it there.
Confronting our own mortality.
Yeah. It's not light reading, that's for sure. But I think it's incredibly important.
He tells this really poignant story about his friend Josh, who tragically died after jumping off a cliff.
Right. And it's just, it's a stark reminder that life is precious and unpredictable.
And we never know how much time we have left.
Exactly. And Manson uses this story to challenge us, to really reevaluate our values and consider what truly matters in the face of our own mortality.
Because it's easy to forget, right? We get caught up in the day-to-day.
Right. We get distracted by all the little things.
And we lose sight of the bigger picture.
Yeah. And I think, this idea of death, it can be really scary, but it can also be incredibly motivating.
How so?
Well, Manson brings in the ideas of Ernest Becker, who wrote about this concept called death terror.
Death terror. That sounds intense.
It is. Basically, Becker argued that a lot of our actions, the things we do, the things we strive for, they're actually driven by this, unconscious desire to leave a mark on the world.
Okay, so like achieving fame or fortune.
Yeah, or creating something that will outlive us, like a legacy. It's almost like we're trying to cheat death by creating something that will continue to exist after we're gone.
But Becker didn't think that was the answer, did he?
No. He believed that this pursuit of immortality is ultimately futile.
Because, none of us are actually going to live forever.
Exactly. And Becker argued that true freedom comes from accepting that, accepting the impermanence of our own lives.
Which, that's a pretty tough pill to swallow, right?
It is. But Manson suggests that by confronting our own mortality, by accepting it, we can actually start to live more authentically.
Because it forces us to ask ourselves, what really matters?
Right. What do we want to be remembered for? How do we want to spend our precious time?
And Manson poses this really challenging question in the book. He says, what if this is all there is? What would you do differently?
It's a question that can really shake things up, If we knew our time was limited, would we be making the same choices? Would we be giving about the same things?
So it's an invitation to re-examine our priority, wasting our lives on things that don't truly align with our values.
Exactly. And that process of choosing what to give a about, it's ongoing.
It's not like a one-time decision.
Right. It's something we have to keep coming back to.
As we grow, as we change.
Exactly. Because our values, they're not static. They can shift and evolve over time. So we need to be willing to check in with ourselves regularly and make sure that we're still on the right track.
It's not like we just decide once and for all, okay, these are things I give a about, and then we're done.
Yeah, it's not a one and done kind of deal.
Yeah. More like a constant process of, checking in with ourselves and asking, is this still important to me, or have my priorities shifted?
Right, and that can be tough because sometimes, those values, they're not always super clear cut.
Like they can change over time?
Yeah, exactly. Like what mattered to us 5 years ago, maybe it's not so important today.
Okay, so how do we even begin to figure out what our values are?
Manson uses this analogy of chipping away at an onion.
An onion.
Yeah, he says that self-awareness, it's kind of like peeling back those layers,
Yeah.
Getting closer and closer to the core of who we are.
So the more we learn about ourselves, the better we understand what we truly value.
Exactly. And he also encourages us to, approach this whole process with a sense of curiosity. It's not about judging ourselves for past choices or, beating ourselves up for the things we maybe got wrong.
It's more about learning from those experiences and then using that knowledge to, make better decisions in the future.
Right. It's about progress, not perfection.
So it's not about finding the right answer. It's more about being open to the process of discovery.
Exactly. And that means embracing uncertainty.
Because a lot of times we cling to certainty.
Yeah, we want to feel like we have it all figured out.
But maybe that's actually holding us back.
Manson definitely thinks so. He says that it's actually in those moments of doubt and uncertainty that we have the greatest potential for growth.
So it's if we're learning a new skill or, starting a new project, we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
We're going to feel frustrated at times.
But that's all part of the process.
If we give up, at the first sign of discomfort, we'll never really get anywhere.
Exactly. And Manson actually gives us some really helpful tools for navigating uncertainty.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
He suggests asking ourselves these 3 questions. What if I'm wrong? What would it mean if I were wrong? And what if I'm right?
That's interesting. So basically, we're forcing ourselves to consider different perspectives.
Right, because a lot of times we're so attached to being right that we don't even allow for the possibility that we might be wrong.
Which can be a real problem.
Yeah, because if we're not willing to be wrong, we're not really open to learning and growing.
So it's we have to be willing to let go of our ego a little bit.
Exactly. And remember, our beliefs and values, they're not static. They're constantly evolving as we gain new experiences and new perspectives.
So the more comfortable we become with uncertainty, the more adaptable and resilient we become.
Because we understand that, failure isn't the opposite of success. It's part of the journey.
And it's often through those so-called failures that we learn the most valuable lessons.
Right. And that's something Manson really emphasizes throughout the book. He encourages us to view those experiences as opportunities for growth, to adjust our course and to keep moving forward.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I hope it sparks some new insights for you.
Yeah, maybe even challenge some of your existing beliefs about what it means to live a fulfilling life.
It's ultimately about choosing your struggles, deciding what truly matters to you, and then letting go of the rest.
And, remembering that it's your life,
What values will guide your choices?
Choose wisely, my friend.